Welcome to this little introduction to impact markets. I'm Don of EAGx, which I've co-founded together with my co-founders Matt and Donnie. At EAGx, we want to generally use innovative market mechanisms for the provision of non-excludable goods, so like public goods and common goods and also network goods. And in particular, we are focused on impact markets, and with impact markets, we are hoping to streamline the grant making, in particular when it comes to research, and in particular within the effective altruism community. We want to enable researchers from around the world to have easier access to funding, especially researchers that are only trying to break into a particular field of research. And we're hoping to, on the flip side, make it easier for the funders to find these excellent giving opportunities, regardless of where they are in the world. We hope to achieve this by allowing these funders to leverage the already existing network of for-profit funders that exists in many countries across the world. So what is an impact market? I like to liken impact markets to fancy prize contests. Usually, the grant making works the way that a funder wants to solve some important problem that humanity faces, and so they ask researchers to propose ways in which they can conduct research that will make progress towards solving that problem. They then collect these proposals, sort through these proposals, and fund the proposals that they find particularly promising. With our kind of fancy prize contest, we want to turn this around. Instead of providing all this money up front, we want to win over the funders to instead provide this funding as a reward for successful projects. They create a prize pool, and they link this prize pool to particular research questions they're interested in. These can be more specific or broader, and they thereby reverse the typical flow of money compared to their traditional grant making. Now, there's an example here. In this example, a funder wants to see relatively specific questions solved, and provides the promise of $1 million to anyone who makes a contribution to this problem. Either the $1 million can go to a person who solves it, or it could be like a prize pool that is then split among everyone who's made a contribution to it. There are lots of variations here, and in the end, the particular market mechanisms will determine which one of them is the most viable solution. Then there are also the contestants, so in our case the researchers, and these researchers use something that we call an impact certificate in order to provide what I like to call an excludable proxy for the sort of non-excludable good that they are providing. So this impact certificate can be understood a bit like a kind of pre-registration of a study. And in this impact certificate, they describe in detail, just like in a pre-registration, what they want to do as a part of their research project. They specify a particular topic approach to it and a particular time frame in which they want to work on it. And then this impact certificate has the property that they can sell shares in it. So these contestants then have this promise from the funder of receiving a large amount of money in the future at some point based on the level of success that they attain. And they can use that promise to seek seed investments from various profit-oriented investors. These investors are then doubly invested in the success of the researchers because their profit, of course, hinges on the success of the researchers, but they're also making this success more likely by providing them with this money and potentially other resources that these investors might have particularly easy access to, such as the network that they often have. So in this example, this team of researchers makes the case to the investors that they have what it takes to solve this problem, and because And that brings us to the investors. These investors can be any sort of profit-oriented investors, though in particular I think that impact investors will have the double bottom-line incentive to contribute to such projects. And these investors will then assess whether they know more about the project than any random person, and in particular the funder knows about it. And if they do know more than the funder, then they may be confident in their assessment that the project is more likely to succeed than the sort of baseline project that would form the reference class into which the project falls for the funder. So in this case, the investor buys a large part of the shares in this impact certificate, maybe some 80% or so, and then invests 160,000 into this team of researchers, with the promise of making 25% profit and expectation, because the investor thinks that this team is actually 20% likely to succeed, as opposed to the funder, who thinks that the team is only 10% likely to succeed because they don't have any special information about this particular team. This simplifies away a few complications, such as that the researcher will probably not sell out of the whole impact certificate, so will probably retain some 10 to 30% of it, depending on what sort of bargaining position they're in. And it also simplifies away some of the complications that come with the funder doing payouts that are proportional to how large they think the contribution that a particular project has made is, and how valuable they think that it is. So it's not as all or nothing as my model implies. But for example, in our last prize contest, we've rewarded a lot of the submissions that we've received, more than half of them, I think, in proportion to how valuable we thought they are. And how valuable we thought they are varied by easily 3 orders of magnitude. So it's not as all or nothing as this simplified model would imply. Now, these for-profit investors are, in my mind, mostly the sort of people who, when they are sort of the earliest seed investors, are the sort of people who have a lot of private information about the researcher. So people who may know the researcher personally, are close friends with them, maybe live in the same group house with them, or people who have a lot of context in the area that the researcher is researching. So, for example, people who know a lot about the particular approach that the researcher wants to take to tackling the problem, and know a lot more about this particular approach than the funder is likely to know. Then at later stages, I think that investors that don't have that context, that might have more money, will want to match the investments that better informed investors have already made. And there could also be buckets of impact certificates that are being put together by researchers that don't have a lot of money to invest, but have a lot of expertise in the field, and so want to spend a few hours to put together recommendations of impact certificates that investors with less context but more money should follow. And these investors, they may then be rewarded according to the profit that the bigger investors make. Here's a graphic representation of this. There's first the initial case where there's a funder who's largely inert. They announce the prize contest, but beyond that they don't do much. Then there is the project, and this project is sort of this abstract idea and this abstract sequence of actions. And there are the 3 groups in this case. The researchers who perform some of these actions, the investors that invest so that the researchers can perform these actions. And then there are also others, because another advantage that the system has is that the researchers can pay other service providers with equity in return for their services, such as copy editing the paper, for example, that they are putting out. And then there is usually, sort of from the point of view of the funder, a 10% chance that such a project will pan out. So in the end, with a 10% chance, the researchers will actually manage to publish some valuable paper. And in that case, the funder, in that case, they or the investors pitch this project to the funder. And then the funder rewards the project, and by extension, everyone who holds shares in this project monetarily. This is probably going to take the shape of them making an offer to buy shares in this in the impact certificate, and that implies that the investors and the researchers can also just refuse to sell all of their shares or some of their shares in order to hold out for later funders who might pay more for them. But why would you do this? Some of the benefits that we see are that this system provides easy access for researchers to funding and infrastructure. Straightforwardly, they'll probably have better access to funding because while there are only these some handful of EA funders, there is a network of for-profit investors in many countries or around the world. And when it comes to smaller funders, many researchers will probably also have friends who are financially a bit better off than they are. Then these investors, especially when they're relatively professional about their investing, will probably also have relatively large networks that the researchers can benefit from and that the investors will be incentivized to share with them. The investors may also specialize in particular areas and so be able to acquire some infrastructure at bulk discounts, as it were. So, for example, buy a whole server with a bunch of GPUs or TPUs and then rent that server out in return for equity to the researchers that they're supporting. This can be cheaper for the investor than to pay the researchers money so that they can rent the same resources from Amazon, for example. Basically, the investors are profiting from economies of scale here to provide these services more cheaply than a generic funder would have been able to. Then researchers may also have the ability to pay service providers in equity, as I've already mentioned, so that is another benefit. I think that this will be particularly interesting for researchers that are trialing some speculative approaches or don't have a large publication record to prove to funders that they have what it takes to publish important research. But they're just starting out and want to break into a particular space. I also think that it will be valuable for researchers that live relatively far away from the big EA hubs because they have a much harder time to get access to the sort of network that funders draw on to find their funding opportunities. Then on the funder side, impact markets provide scaling support for the funders. First of all, they get access to this vast network of funding opportunities that opens up to them thanks to this network of for-profit investors that they can leverage. And then impact markets also promise to cut down on their time investment by an order of magnitude because they only have to review the projects that have already been successful. And arguably, it's perhaps also easier to review a project that's already been successful because you really only need to consider the project. It's already clear that the team behind the project has been able to realize this project, so you don't need to probe their characters as much. Then we think that impact market will also slightly reduce the monetary cost of the funding. Many investors will have a sufficiently large informational advantage that the prices that they'll be willing to accept in return for their investments will be sufficiently low that the funders don't have to pay up all the way to their willingness to pay, but can negotiate a somewhat lower price. So they may save some 20% or so of the costs that they would otherwise have to invest in order to realize projects. And a bit more speculatively, we think that it's also plausible that it will lead to a larger hiring pool for funders, because currently the people who work for funders need to be a healthy mix of people who are experts in priorities research and people who have great people skills. Ideally, these skills should be combined in the same person, but with impact markets, the second group is outsourced to the for-profit investors who are in many cases already specialized in this sort of thing, so that the team that works for the funders can be much more specialized in priorities research. They can also outsource the priorities research to groups like Rethink Priorities, of course, but that doesn't have to do so much with impact markets. Finally, impact markets, of course, trivially promise a profit for for-profit investors, but they also provide a way for impact investors to invest into projects that are at the same time profitable and generate a sizable social bottom line. Many impact investors that I have talked to have this problem that as soon as they filter the sort of project that they want to invest into for projects that are at all profitable, the social bottom line, the impact of these projects is relatively minuscule. So with impact markets, they'd be able to invest some of the almost top most impactful projects, while at the same time making a sizable monetary profit as well. So what are challenges that we've run into? One challenge is to measure the impact that we're actually having. Here I mean the counterfactually valid impact. So there is the risk that when you ask relatively broad research questions as a funder, that people who would have worked on something anyway just also submit that to the contest for some extra money. But you're not incentivizing any research that would not otherwise have happened. That is probably not a huge problem because the money is probably relatively well spent on the sort of people who are already doing extremely valuable research, but it is probably not optimal. A more nefarious version of this problem is that if you ask very specific research questions, then these specific research questions with money behind them might be less important than the questions that a researcher is already working on, but this researcher would then switch from the more important question to the less important one because they can get paid for the less important one, and they might just need this money really badly. So both very specific and very broad questions have some advantages and disadvantages, and I should note there are even more advantages and disadvantages than those. We have a list of those in a Google Doc, but there are also remedies to that. So for example, you can ask relatively specific research questions, but then also leave the option for researchers to submit new questions to your contest that you can then review and add to your list later on so that the researcher can work on the question that they want to work on and yet get paid for it. You, of course, will need to determine in that case whether you're actually likely to incentivize some kind of factually valid impact with this newly added question. Another idea that Jojo Lee has had is that we could just assign randomized caps to the valuations that we, or the funders for that matter, assign to projects. So when we try to gauge how valuable we think a project has been, we might determine that the value of this project is at $80,000, but the randomized cap that we've assigned to it is only $25,500. So if we want to buy 10% of that project, then we'll bid for those 10% up to $2,550, and that is something that is transparently communicated in advance, so that researchers who want to work on a particular question but see that the cap's relatively low may decide not to pursue that question and rather focus on a different one. So if the end result is that researchers tend toward the questions that have higher caps assigned to them, then that would indicate that these monetary payouts actually motivate people to take up these questions, whereas if there's very little correlation between them, it's more likely that other things determine what someone wants to work on, rather than the monetary payouts. Finally, the incentives change again for relatively big projects. So if the initial funding that a project requires is large enough that it's relatively unlikely that any researcher will be willing or able to invest that much money up front, then they are relatively dependent on investors. In those cases, they will then sell some shares in their impact certificate to investors for seed investment. But more interestingly, in other cases where they are able to afford the seed investment themselves, they will be incentivized not to sell any shares to seed investors, because seed investors will generally pay relatively bad prices for them, and the researchers will be better off holding on to their shares and then selling them to the retro funders directly. So by focusing on relatively large projects, we reduce the share of projects where people have the ability to fund them themselves without seed investments. And so it becomes much more likely that all of these projects that have attracted seed investments are projects that would not otherwise have happened. And secondly, one of our main focuses over the past year, or at this point more than a year, has been on identifying and mitigating any risks that might come with impact markets. We've written comprehensive blog posts on our Substack and on the EA forum, and we've summarized all of these risks and our proposed mitigations for them in a Google Doc. These risks take the shape of, for example, the problem of moral trade, where what could happen is that two projects work against each other in the way that is like a common sight in the political arena, and so basically just both burn money while not achieving anything. We want to rather set incentives, and for that have particular norms that we want to establish on these marketplaces, that people should, to the extent that they can, cooperate with each other and generate what we call gains from moral trade through the projects that they come up with as a result. There are also systems like Polis that were trialed in Taiwan, and there's also the S process that might help address problems like this. So we're relatively optimistic that we have the tools that are necessary to keep these problems under control. There's also the problem that we call the distribution mismatch. In this case, it's about a particular kind of failure to conduct a moral trade. In this case, it's the problem that the distribution of profits that investors can make is unlimited in the upward direction, but is limited at zero in the downward direction. So they can at most lose all of their investment. Conversely, the impact distribution is not limited in any way, in any direction. So the impact of a project can be arbitrarily good, but it can also be arbitrarily harmful. Now, what we're afraid investors might do is to just willy-nilly invest into all sorts of projects without doing much research, and maybe even with a bias toward projects that seem particularly flashy or something of the sort. Maybe these particularly flashy projects are also the particularly risky projects, but these investors wouldn't care and would just invest into all of these risky projects the same amount of money relatively blindly without doing much research. Even though some of these projects, if they fail, they just lose the investment, whereas if other projects fail, it might lead to some major catastrophe. That is a problem that we want to mitigate with various norms that we want to establish on the marketplace, but also with very careful curation and know your customer, so that we know the identities of the people who participate on the marketplace, so that we can also ban bad actors. The curation comes into play when it comes to all the individual impact certificates. So whenever someone submits an impact certificate to the marketplace, a curation team should look at it and determine whether it should be published or whether it should be removed. But it also applies with regard to the researchers, the investors, and the retro funders in this marketplace. So at the moment, we envision that the retro funders will be relatively limited. Maybe we find one, maybe a couple of them. Ideally, we'd have to like to have a few more to have a bit of a diversity of opinions. But on the researcher side, we expect that a larger number of them will start using the marketplace at some point, and we would also like to get a number of investors onto the marketplace. So in those cases, it will be important to know who these people are, and if they misbehave and publish projects that are excessively risky, then to be able to remove them from the marketplace. One thing that can aid us in establishing these norms are prediction markets. When it comes to norms, it's not only important that retro funders and by extension everyone else in the market commits to these norms, but also that they commit to these norms transparently so that everyone else knows that they're committed to these norms, and that they commit to these norms in a way that makes it likely for the other market participants that they'll also be able to implement these norms. And this is where prediction markets will be helpful. We would like to have prediction markets for the altruistic value of every impact certificate, so that we have afterwards a history of estimates of this value. And if a project that is extremely risky just sort of by accident pans out really well and turns out to have a large positive impact, then that is still not something that we want to incentivize, and that is still not something that a funder wants to incentivize. But someone who starts such a project may reason that once the project, like in the worlds where the project is successful, that there the funders will be blind to the risks that the project originally had, because they'll be so blinded by the success of the project. And this is where the history of predictions from a prediction market will come in handy. There, the funders can debias themselves by looking at this history, and in particular look at the time before it became clear that the project will be successful. Other tools that we're already using in order to enhance our markets are exposé certificates. Exposé certificates are simply certificates that someone can submit to the market and then get rewarded for them. And these certificates point to other certificates that violate market norms, and they aim to expose certificates that should be removed from the platform, but that have somehow slipped through the curation process. So once the curation team decides that the writer of the exposé certificate is right, and these can also be submitted to the curation team directly without having to be published, then the curation team rewards the person for helping them curate the market. Eventually, we would like to introduce more incentive mechanisms that point in the same direction. So once we have enough volume on the market, it will become plausible and feasible to use a derivative that's called a perpetual future, in order to make it easy for people to short impact certificates or buckets of impact certificates. That, in turn, will incentivize people to try to find really bad impact certificates, then open the short positions on these certificates or buckets of certificates that contain them, and then to publish their exposés in order to cause everyone else to sell out of them and for the price to drop. That is another incentive mechanism that we want to develop. Finally, we also have this idea of establishing insurances. And here the idea is to have a mandatory insurance for every impact certificate, and to have a competition between insurers who insure impact certificates, so that if no insurer is ready to insure a particular impact certificate, this certificate has no way of entering the market in the first place. This way we'd have basically an auditor network, and these insurances would also not only pay out in a case where a catastrophe actually happens, where they would sometimes have to pay out like billions or trillions, but would pay out in cases where a trusted curation team or an oracle later finds that an impact certificate should not have been published on the market, and will thereby make the insurances a lot more affordable and at the same time the payouts a lot less lumpy. Then finally, there are also legal limitations. So for now, we think that it's only feasible for close friends to invest into impact certificates through private placement, for institutional investors to invest in them, and for accredited investors or some equivalents in other countries than the US. The reason for that is that many countries have relatively restrictive securities law. So, for example, in the US, any researcher who wants to issue an impact certificate that should be like publicly tradable and not only tradable among accredited investors would have to register this impact certificate with the SEC, which is like a multi-year process that involves like dozens of lawyers and millions of dollars or so. So this is completely infeasible for a lot of these researchers. They're just trying to fundraise their like 20,000 or so that they need to pay their rent. So we'll probably only be able to open this market to these particular groups of professional investors. Another strategy that we found that might help with that is to not let the researchers individually do any issuing at all, but to rather have a non-profit that does all the issuing of the impact certificates. The way this would work is that the charity or this nonprofit issues an impact certificate. Then an investor buys shares in this impact certificate from the charity for a certain amount of money. And then this charity pays a researcher to implement a particular project from that money. So the researcher is simply a service provider that does some research in return for a standard contractual payment. And all the investing happens between this nonprofit and all the investors. This has the advantage that nonprofits, in the US at least, have an exemption from the registration requirement of securities with the SEC. Now, we don't think that impact certificates are securities. They can be consumed. I think they will, in most cases, be consumed eventually by altruistic retrofunders. But if the SEC decides that they still don't need to be registered, thanks to the exemption that these nonprofits enjoy. Finally, there is also the option to just make it impossible to transfer the ownership in impact certificates. In this case, we would lose out on some of the most promising features of impact markets, but we could still retroactively reward researchers and investors for the work that they've done in enabling people to conduct important research, even though no shares in the project or shares in the impact certificate change hands. So what are our current bottlenecks? Currently, we are mostly looking for people who have a lot of expertise in grant making so that we can really build the sort of platform that is maximally useful for them. We would like to closely collaborate with some grant makers who can give us input in what sort of features are most important to them so that we can build these features first and don't waste time on features that, in the end, they don't even need that much. Ideally, these grant makers would then also be people who actually use our markets for a longer time so that we have continual feedback on what works and what needs to be improved and can make these improvements iteratively and then get feedback on them as well from the same grant makers. This is sort of collaboration that we're looking for at the moment. And secondly, a lot of this hinges on software development. So I'm currently the only full-time software developer that we have. So I'm looking for help, and we have a really nice and modern tech stack with TypeScript and React and Prisma, which is fully typed backend and frontend, and that makes it very pleasant to work with. So who wants to use this? Vitalik Buterin has written about retroactive funding in collaboration with Optimism and Ethereum Layer 2 solution. And Optimism has switched to rewarding people in their ecosystem through retroactive funding. They're not using any sort of impact market for this, but they're just paying out retroactive funding without any ownership changing hands. But this is something that already goes in the right direction. Then Scott Alexander is interested in using something like impact markets for the next Astral Codex 10 grant round. The Foresight Institute is interested in using impact markets for their research funding. The Survival and Flourishing Fund is using something like impact markets internally for their grant making. Protocol Labs is a major player in the field. Protocol Labs is developing standards for the Ethereum blockchain to standardize how impact certificates or an abstraction that they call hyper certificate should work. And once they have the standard in place, they're planning to write smart contracts and then build platforms on top of that can be used to trade impact certificates. Once Protocol Labs has reached that stage and there are actually some smart contracts that we can build upon, we would like to review whether we want to and whether we think it is sensible to use their architecture to build our impact markets upon. Importantly, there's also Manifold, and Manifold is interested in building the prediction markets on the value of impact certificates that I've already mentioned earlier in the context of risk mitigation. These can also be very useful for retrofunders that get swamped with too many pitches for projects to retrofund, and want to use prediction markets in order to establish some sort of threshold that a project first has to cross on the prediction market before they start reviewing it themselves. That's it for impact markets for now. If you would like to learn more, then please go to impactmarkets, one word in the plural, .io, and there you'll find a link to our Discord that you can join that has a lot more resources, and you can also find links to our Substack. Our Substack is impactmarkets.substack.com, again, impact markets in the plural. Most of our work is coordinated on Discord, so please do consider joining our Discord and help us build a bright future for impact markets.